Welcome back for week 21 of the NHL Power Rankings, which this week we do in honor of Alex Wennberg. Not that he's gone entirely or anything like that, he's still playing in the NHL, he just left the Kraken to go to the Rangers via trade at the deadline, and wore number 21 with the Kraken, so hence the in honor of Wennberg. Anyway, as far as the Power Rankings are concerned, this week, well, it's pretty much the same teams, and look, I tried to find a reason to get a new team into the top 10, freshen things up a bit, as it has kind of just been moving around deck chairs on the, well, not really the Titanic since all these teams have done well, but it's basically just been rearranging the same 10 teams for the last few weeks. I just couldn't really find a good reason to take one of the top 10 teams out of the top 10 to be replaced by one of the two teams I have as honorable mentions. Those two being, same as last week for one of them in the Nashville Predators, who although they did lose 2 of their 4 games this week, they lost both of them in overtime, so they extend their point streak to 12 games, even if the win streak did come to an end at 8. Still, for the Predators, it's, annoyingly as a Kraken fan, a point streak that could not have come at a better time for them, as they have pretty well solidified themselves as one of the 2 wildcard teams in the West. They still have quite a gap to jump to get one of the top 3 spots in the Central, so I don't know that that's going to happen. But unless they fall apart in the same way that they got hot, this is a team that's destined for the postseason. And then with my second honorable mention in the New York Islanders, this is not a team that would be in the 11th or 12th spot if I were to continue doing the entire list of 32 teams if I had that kind of time, but is still a team that I felt was worth mentioning here, as they too have gotten hot to get themselves into a playoff spot. Now, unlike the Predators, they haven't necessarily solidified themselves in one of those wildcard spots, but thanks to their 6-game winning streak, they have jumped up to claim that second wildcard spot, at least for the time being, in the East. Jumping into the top 10, though, we start in the 10th spot with the Edmonton Oilers, who do drop 3 spots to go right back to this 10th spot where they came from 2 weeks ago, and a large part of the reason for this is that the 3 teams that they jumped last week that were below them went a combined 9-0-1 this week, so that combined with a middling week for the Oilers means that they do end up just dropping. More they get jumped than they fall below those teams. Either way, it has the same result. They end up in 10th with a week that did feature 2 wins, one of which is against one of those 3 teams that get above them in the Boston Bruins. An overtime win, but a win nonetheless. And then they finish out their week with a 4-0 shutout of the Pittsburgh Penguins, who have kind of been struggling lately. So it really was the middle of the week that was the problem for the Oilers, as they lose their second game of the week, 4-2 in regulation, obviously, to the Blue Jackets. Not a very good loss, and those do happen, but you're going to get punished when you're a top 10 team losing to one of the worst teams in the league. And then follow that up with a 3-2 loss in overtime, so they at least get a point in the standings, but still a loss to the Sabres, who did sell at the deadline. I mean, I guess it wasn't a total fire sale. They did pick up Bowen Byram in exchange for Middlestat, so they at least got something in exchange that actually affects their team right now. Still a team that the Oilers should definitely be able to beat. And I suppose while we're on that subject, it was kind of a quiet deadline, I would say, for the Oilers, especially for a team that's definitely in win-now mode. Now, they still do pick up Troy Stecher from Arizona on the blue line and Adam Henrique on the forward end from the Ducks, and they do end up trading a first-round pick in exchange to get Henrique, among other things. Sam Carrick also comes over in that deal. Still not necessarily the big splashes that we've been used to seeing Edmonton at least try to make, especially on the defensive end. Though, I suppose, to be fair, the weaknesses on this Oilers team are a little bit less obvious than they have been in years past, where usually with the Oilers, they're desperate to get any help they can keeping the puck out of their own net, usually on defense, but also in net. Whereas this season, when they've been at their best, it's largely been because of their defense and goaltending. So maybe the biggest weakness was their offensive depth, and maybe that's where Henrique or maybe even Sam Carrick come in. That all said, again, to be clear, like I said last week, the trades made at the deadline aren't going to directly affect these power rankings, with me just trying to guess who I think won or lost given trades, what teams got stronger. I'm just going to wait and see how these teams play over the next few weeks, and certainly part of that was this week, with the trade deadline being on Friday. But even still, with this being the first power ranking since the deadline, I'm still going to mention what happened with these teams in the power rankings at the deadline, so we have an idea of what to watch and what could happen over the next few weeks, even if it's not going to directly affect the rankings for this week, and it's up to those players to prove that they've helped the team or hurt the team to see that actual change happen. And heck, since it's relevant, I'll even mention when a team really didn't do anything notable at the deadline, like the team I have at 9th in the Toronto Maple Leafs. Now, the Leafs did make a handful of trades, but it's a lot of just kind of playing around the edges, with the most significant one probably being picking up Lyubushkin on the defensive end, which they did a little bit ahead of the deadline to fill a spot due to injury on their defensive end. So once again, this is a Leafs team that didn't do much of anything significant at the deadline to try to meaningfully bolster this offense going into another playoff run. And sure, this is a roster that I would say is more than talented enough on paper to make a deep playoff run, especially with Auston Matthews playing the way that he is. But we've seen this same roster fail to go very far in the playoffs, even in seasons past, where they have gotten significant help at the deadline. Like last year, for example, I'd say they got quite a bit of help and still barely made it to the second round, where they only won the one game. But again, we'll have to wait and see how that all pans out. As for why the Leafs are in 9th, dropping 5 spots from last week, well, they certainly had the toughest week of any of the teams in this top 10, with most of the teams, actually a lot of them, winning all of their games going perfect on the week. Okay, actually there might be one team left on this list that did, technically speaking, by win-loss record, have a worse week than the Leafs did, but still it was not a very good week for Toronto, especially considering their 2 losses were both 4-1 to the Boston Bruins, who, like I said in last week's video, those were definitely going to be games to watch, as the Bruins are very likely to be their first round opponent, which is still true with the Leafs basically locked into that 3rd spot in the Atlantic, and then it's just up to whether the Bruins or Panthers end up winning the division, with the team that doesn't win the division hosting the Leafs in the first round. And while they did win their other 2 games on the week, they weren't necessarily impressive wins, as they were both 1-goal wins in regulation, but still 1-goal wins against the Sabres and Habs, who both sold at the deadline. Moving on though to the 8th spot, I have a team here in the Colorado Avalanche who, well, I have said this before, so who knows if it actually happens this time, but I do have a feeling this is an Avalanche team that's just going to be moving their way up these rankings over the next few weeks into the end of the season, because I do like what they did at the deadline. They definitely bolstered their team on the offensive end, not only with depth and pickups like Jakob Trenin, which I think is sneakily a good one, and Brendan Duhaime, and obviously add to their top 6 as well with that pickup of Middlestat that I already mentioned with the Sabres. And yeah, they do lose Bowen Byram to get Middlestat, which is not ideal, but you pick up Sean Walker to basically, well, not necessarily replace him, but certainly another good defenseman to take one of those spots on the defensive end, really not hurting your defense too much to definitely make the offense quite a bit better, at least on paper anyway. We'll see how it pans out, but this is still a team that is very strong on the top end, as Nathan MacKinnon just continues to tear up the league. 10 points in 3 games this week, all 3 of which the Avalanche won, which when it comes to that, as far as why they're still just in the 8th spot, they did move up 2 spots, so it's not like they didn't go anywhere after winning 3 games. But again, with this being a pretty good week for a lot of the teams in this list, again, it was going to be hard to make a huge jump up the list, aside from a couple of teams that do make pretty significant jumps that we'll get to here in just a second. But those teams, I think more this week proved that they just had a couple of off weeks and are now back to being themselves. Anyway, for the Avalanche, this is a team that's playing very well, and at least on paper, seems to be constructed well on top of that going into the playoffs, and made their team, I would say, certainly noticeably better, which was already a very good team before this last week. Moving on to the 7th spot, though, I have one of Colorado's division rivals, and maybe the team they'll face in the first round, in the Dallas Stars. Now, right out of the gate, I got to admit, this is probably the team on this list that I feel the worst about where they are, and I just got to apologize to Stars fans, especially considering I think they drop a spot after winning all 3 games on the week. Now, that being said, they did start out their week in the same way that it ended last week, with a squeaker of a win in extra time over the woeful San Jose Sharks. They still did win it, and they bounced back with 2 pretty good wins, a blowout of the Ducks, which they should be able to do, and then a 4-1 win over the Kings, so a good week for the Stars. And on top of all that, as far as the trade deadline is concerned, they only made the 1 move, but it could be a pretty significant one if he can stay healthy, as they pick up Chris Tanev from the Flames in exchange for a couple of picks and a prospect, but still definitely helps this team going down the stretch and into a playoff run. So then, again, with all that going well for them, and also Wyatt Johnson, their young second-year player, having a 4-goal, 6-point week in 3 games, why they're still in 7th place, and again, I think dropping a spot, to be honest, I really don't have necessarily a great explanation that I think it's going to be satisfying for any Stars fans watching this. Ultimately, it just came down to there were a couple of teams that I felt like were too low last week, and maybe they deserved to be there, but had weeks that deserved to jump significantly up this list, and that did mean going back above the Stars. So although they had a good week, they kind of just suffer because of other teams having better weeks. Now, that being said, the team just above them did not have a very good week, and if it wasn't for how good they've been playing up until this week, I probably would have swapped these 2 teams. In fact, you probably still could make the argument that the Stars could be in 6th, and this team would be in 7th, but finishing out the run of Central Division teams, in 6th I have the Winnipeg Jets, who did have record-wise the worst week of any team on this list, as they go 1-2 on the week, losing to the Kraken, then beating the Kraken, but then getting absolutely blown out by the Canucks on the second half of the back-to-back. And I gotta say, since I was at the game, the win against the Kraken that they had in the middle of that was not the most impressive win. Sure, it is a 3-0 shutout, but that was really more Bressois than anything else, as the Jets were just able to overcome some very sloppy play that they had going on that game and take advantage of slightly more sloppy play that the Kraken had. They get an empty net to make it look a little bit more lopsided on the scoreboard, but it was not a game that they played particularly well, even if they do get the win. Even still, it is just one bad week for the Jets, who had been playing very well over the last few weeks and really since the start of November otherwise, so I didn't want to punish them too much, and they do drop 3 spots, so it's already a decent drop that they have for a not very great week. Now, is it a little bit concerning that the 2 games that they lost were both games that Hellebuyck started and played all of, not to mention that all 9 of the goals that they had scored against them in that game came with Hellebuyck in net? It's certainly not ideal. I would still say Hellebuyck's the front runner for the Vezina at this point in time. It is just 2 games, but this is not the time of year that you want to even be raising an eyebrow at your goaltending. It does help that, like I said, Bressois has been fantastic all season long for them as a backup, so even if Hellebuyck does start to struggle here down the stretch, they still have another very good goaltender that can step in and take some of the load to hopefully get Hellebuyck a little bit fresher going into the postseason. And ultimately, almost no matter what, unless one of them just completely falls off the face of the earth, all 3 of these last 3 teams are basically guaranteed to be in the playoffs and very likely to be the top 3 teams in the Central, unless one of them really falls off and Nashville stays hot to take one of those spots. Still, all 3 of them are in the playoffs. It's just a matter of what order they end up finishing in. And then, as we move into the top 5, this is where, in the 5th spot, I have the Boston Bruins, moving all the way up from, I think, 9th last week, having a very good week. They do have the 1 overtime loss to Edmonton that I already mentioned earlier, but have those 2 4-1 wins over Toronto, who was in 4th spot last week, and finish the week with a 5-1 win over that struggling Penguins team. So for the Bruins, even with the 1 overtime loss, all things considered, it was a very good week, especially those 2 wins over a potential first-round opponent in Toronto, and a good week especially for guys like Pavel Zacha, who has 5 goals in a 4-game week, as well as Pastrnak and DeBrusk both have 6-point weeks, and Pastrnak, you're kind of used to that, but the Bruins starting to score goals again, getting good goaltending on top of it, and this is a team that certainly seems to be proving that that 2-week span of things not going very well was more of an anomaly rather than a trend to be worried about here going into the rest of the season. Now, who knows, maybe they'll end up going 0-3 this next week and I'll end up eating my words and putting them right back down towards the bottom of the list, but at least for now, it seems like the Bruins are back, and as far as the deadline is concerned, they didn't necessarily make any massive moves, but they do add Pat Maroon, who, sure, at 35 isn't in his prime anymore and isn't necessarily having the best season ever, but at the same time, this is a player that definitely knows how to win in the postseason, as we saw for a number of years in Tampa Bay with the Lightning, and that is something that any team, and especially this Bruins team, could certainly use more of going into the playoffs. Not that they don't already have a significant amount of it as it stands. And then up next, once again, tied at the hip with the Boston Bruins, in the 4th spot, I have the Vancouver Canucks, who, like the Bruins, had a very good week to jump way up this list from the 8th spot last week. Once again, like the Bruins, proving that the last couple weeks were probably more of a bump or 2 in the road rather than something to be worried about through the back half of the season and going into the playoffs. Now, as far as the whole trade deadline aspect of things is concerned with the Canucks, unlike a lot of the other teams on this list, they really didn't do anything new here in the last week, as they pretty much already made their big splashes over the course of the season with the additions of Zadorov and Lindholm from the Flames. And as far as the more recent one, the Lindholm one, is concerned, early returns are still not great on that one, as Lindholm has just 4 goals and 3 assists for 7 points in 17 games with the Canucks. Meanwhile, just one of the pieces that went the Flames' way, the active player in the NHL, in Kuzmenko, has 5 goals and 3 assists for 8 points in 13 games. So, you know, still early on, and who knows what Lindholm could do once he gets a little bit more used to the Canucks system. But 17 games is not a small amount, and you'd like to see a little bit more from a guy that you traded Kuzmenko, a couple prospects, and a couple picks, including a first for. And especially so if you can't get him signed to a new contract with him being a UFA at the end of the season. Either way, at least as far as this week is concerned, things went well for the Canucks regardless of that, as they do pick up 3 wins against the Kings in overtime, then Vegas, and then that big shutout 5-0 over the Jets, all 3 of which are wins against teams that are very likely, if not certain, to be in the postseason, and could end up being teams the Canucks face in that postseason run. However much of one they have. Up next in the 3rd spot, though, I have a team that is every game looking more and more like one that is destined to have a deep playoff run in the Carolina Hurricanes, who are clicking on all cylinders at this point in time. They go 3-0 on the week and 3 very decisive victories. Now, sure, none of the 3 were against teams currently in a playoff spot or likely to make the playoffs, as the first was against the Habs, 4-1 victory there, then a 4-2 victory over the Devils, who still have an outside chance, but it's not looking likely, and then a 7-1 stomping of the Flames, who, like the Devils, outside chance, but probably not going to happen, especially with how much they've sold over this season and again at the deadline. Actually, sorry, quick correction, a 7-2 stomping of the Flames, discounting the Flames' 1 goal there. Either way, a very decisive victory for the Hurricanes as they score 15 goals in 3 games and give up just 5. So obviously then, not only is this a team that's having no trouble, or at least very little trouble, keeping the puck out of their own net between the fantastic, maybe even best in the league defense at this point in time, and some pretty quality goaltending with the combination of Anderson and Kochetkov in net, but they're also now scoring at an absolutely ridiculous rate. I mean, 4 goals per game is pretty good, and then 7 goals is very good in that game against the Flames. But that scoring is also not just coming from only their top 6, it's been pretty spread out, as the only guy to get 2 goals in any one of those games was Brady Shea, and that was in the first one against the Habs. So it's 4 different goal scorers against the Devils, and then 7 different goal scorers against the Flames. And then add to that via the trade deadline, Evgeny Kuznetsov from the Capitals, and Jake Gensel, as well as Ty Smith, but Gensel is clearly the headliner in that trade, from the Penguins. So this is a team that not only is playing very well, but made some pretty good additions at the trade deadline that could make them even better going through these last few games of the season and into a postseason where they look destined to make a deep run. Now, we've thought good things about them going into the playoffs before, and, well, as we know, the playoffs, anything goes, so who knows what actually happens, but this is a team that seems like everything's going good for them at this point in time. But even for everything that has gone well for the Canes, though, here over this last stretch of games, it hasn't caught them any closer to the team that's in first in their division and second in these power rankings in the New York Rangers, who do have a quiet week. They go just 1-1, so not fantastic even in just 2 games. The one loss, though, is understandable. It's a 4-2 loss to the Panthers, who, well, is the only team that we haven't talked about yet. And then they come back with a 4-0 convincing shutout of the Blues. So still a team that's playing pretty well, and like I said, keeping one of the hottest teams in the NHL in the Canes at bay to hold that top spot in the division. Now it still is a close race between those 2 teams for that top spot in the Metro, as the Rangers only have a 2-point lead on the Canes, with 1 game in hand, so playing the way that they are, that's basically a 4-point lead, but it could swing either way with still just under 20 games remaining. So with that being the case, it'll be interesting to see over this last stretch of games how the different approaches these 2 teams had to the trade deadline ends up affecting that race, with the Canes making a couple of pretty big trades that we just talked about, and the Rangers kind of just playing around the edges. They pick up Ruido on the blue line for some defensive depth from the Penguins, and then they get Roslovic from the Blue Jackets on the forward end, as well as Alex Wennberg from the Kraken, who again is the inspiration for this video. Which none of those were bad moves by any stretch of the imagination. I still do think that makes the team better, and Wennberg in particular I think is an underrated pickup for them. He doesn't necessarily shine on the stat sheet or anything like that, but he does a lot of the little things well that could make very much a difference for other players scoring on the team when it comes to setting up plays and getting the puck through the neutral zone and into the offensive end, which hasn't always been a strength of this Rangers team throughout the season. So with all that said, although these 2 teams are very unlikely to meet in the first round of the playoffs, it seems not unlikely they could end up meeting the second round for whichever team comes out of that Metro part of the bracket. And as far as which team goes into that part of the bracket with the first seed, a big game to watch will be the one coming up on Tuesday, the last meeting between these 2 teams for the season. Obviously, there's a lot of other games that will also make a difference, but that head-to-head matchup will very much be one to watch, especially for the Rangers, with it being the second half of a back-to-back, playing the Devils on Monday night. And that then just leaves in the first spot, once again, the Florida Panthers, who just keep chugging right along, winning game after game after game. They do have 1 loss this week. They lose 2-1 to the Flyers, but at least that's a close loss to a team currently in a divisional playoff spot. And then they have 3 pretty convincing wins: the 4-2 win over the Rangers that I already mentioned, then a 5-3 win over the Devils, and a 5-1 win over the Flames. So this is a team that, again, there's just not a lot to hate about how they're playing hockey at this point in time and going down this stretch of the last month, and if they can keep it up into a postseason where they very well may go in with the first overall seed in the East. Of course, I say there's not a lot to hate about how they're playing. There's not a lot to hate about how they're playing unless you're the team playing against them, in which case there's not a lot to like about how they're playing against you, but that's a separate issue. Although, I suppose it is worth mentioning that the Panthers might be slowing down here a little bit. After all, this last 10-game stretch was a worse 10-game stretch than the 10 games they played before it, as they've been just 8-2 in these last 10 games, where they were 9-1 in the 10 previous. So obviously, I'm mostly kidding there. They are then 17-3 in their last 20 games, having no trouble picking up points pretty consistently and keeping the Bruins, well, not only passing the Bruins in that time, but now keeping them at arm's length to get that first spot in the Atlantic if they can keep this pace up, which they do come up against a tougher stretch here in the next week. They've got Dallas up next, then that Carolina Hurricanes team, which, as far as those 3 losses are concerned, with how well the Canes are playing, one of those is the 1-0 shutout at the hands of the Hurricanes. So even though the Panthers continue to play well defensively in that game, and they've had no trouble keeping the puck out of their own net, the offense did slow down for that one game. And that has pretty much been the only way the Panthers have lost games recently, is if their offense just doesn't really work out for a certain night. But obviously it's working much more than it isn't. And when it is working, much like the Hurricanes, they're getting contributions from all up and down the lineup, which now, thanks to the trade deadline, includes Vladimir Tarasenko, who definitely has some offensive upside of his own and can help this team through the back stretch and into the postseason. And actually, also, while I was looking at trades, I noticed that they picked up a goaltender depth in Magnus Hellberg, which isn't likely to make any difference to them, certainly not in the playoffs, but even down this last stretch of games. But I'd want to point out that that's at least a fun pickup to me. Hellberg is a guy that spent a little bit of time in Seattle, and he's just an absolute beauty of a human being. He was an instant fan favorite for the people that went to practices, constantly interacting with fans afterwards when he would do the little bit of extra practice for the healthy scratches and that kind of stuff. Just a great guy, and he's bounced around the league now over the last couple seasons, but it's good to see him still bouncing around the NHL and being relevant enough for teams to trade for him. As always, though, I'd love to know your thoughts down in the comment section below, who your top 10 teams would be, what teams you think I have higher or lower, and if you're going to be critical, which is totally fair. I understand these power rankings are a polarizing thing. These are just my opinions ultimately, and they are based on really knowing the game pretty well, I would say. There are people in the comments that tend to disagree with that, but I disagree with their disagreement. Either way, let me know what you think down in the comment section. And until next time, stay safe out there, be good to each other, God bless, and go Kraken, or even ex-Kraken players. For Wemberg, good luck in the playoffs.